Okay, so it's a warm welcome from Catalyst 14 to everybody that's listening to the session live. So I'm Damien Wamfor, I'm the founder of Catalyst 14, and I'll be facilitating the conversation this afternoon with my guest and somebody I've known for a long time now, Tony Smurden, and I'll introduce Tony and talk a bit more about the purpose of the session in a moment. So in terms of this session, we're going to be running for between 30 minutes and 45 minutes today, depending on the questions that come from the group. Just to say, you are all on listen-only mode in terms of this format for this webinar. So please use the chat panel, engage with us, engage with the group, pose any questions during the session or reflections. It'd be lovely to try and make this as interactive as we can. And there will be certain moments where I'm going to pause and just ask for some of your input. So please use the chat panel. Just to say, the session is being recorded, so it will appear on our YouTube channel after today, along with a blog from Tony Smurden on unconscious bias as well, just to sort of give you some further information. I would encourage everyone to shut down any other applications. This just helps with the transmission speed. I'd also always recommend having a pen and paper handy, because I'm sure there's going to be some areas you'd like to capture in terms of your own practice as you're listening. So in terms of the session, unconscious bias, just to say that this came as a result of a conversation that Tony and I were having, just in terms of her research that she was carrying out around this topic, and really how little there was that was written for coaches. So that was really the intent behind running the session today. I imagine as coaches, this may be a conversation that you're having with leaders that you're working with. A number of organizations now are running diversity and inclusivity training for their leadership population. So sometimes leaders might be using the space in coaching to make sense of the training. But I think for us, and hopefully I can speak for you as well, Tony, the intent here really is to help us reflect on, what we might be experiencing in our practice. And as always, let's look at this not being the truth, but it gives us a lens to look in on perhaps some of the relational dynamics that may be playing out for us as coaches in our work. So that's, I suppose, a high-level view of the intent. We really are going to explore what unconscious bias is. We're going to look at how this may play out in coaching. And I suppose the pragmatic aspect of this is really thinking about what we can do. So in terms of Tony, let me just introduce the guest today. So in a prior life, Tony was a litigation lawyer. So having sort of 25 years of extensive private practice, but also the regulatory experience as well. And then Tony decided to change direction and trained as an executive coach. So now works and in terms of an independent business, providing executive coaching, but also training as well. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you.
And thanks for making the time today. Before we start the conversation, actually, I thought it'd be useful, firstly for you, so this is the people listening, just to bring a coachee to mind. So the invitation is to reflect on somebody that you're working with where perhaps the relationship doesn't feel as good as it normally does. Maybe you're noticing even a bit of heart sinking when you know that the client is coming up and you're going to be working with them. But just where perhaps the relationship doesn't feel as easy as it usually does within your work. So I'm just going to give you a moment to bring someone to mind. And the purpose of asking you to do this is just so we can make this more pragmatic for you in terms of applying some of the thinking here in terms of this relationship. Okay. And again, I'm just going to then pause again and just really invite any questions that you have about this topic, as coaches, or it might be wider as leaders. But if you have any questions, it'd be really useful to see some on the chat panel. So again, Tony and I can make sure that I'm facilitating this conversation in a way that's answering those questions. So thinking about unconscious bias, what are the questions you're holding? And please feel free to just add those to the chat panel. And we're just going to pause for a moment while you do that. So any questions that you have, please feel free to type them in. Thank you, Mike. So I can see how to surface unconscious bias to be conscious. And from Robin, how do you most easily spot bias in yourself? Which is a good reflection. I know you'll pick up on this, Tony. How to bring it up in a coaching session, where to start, is about how to notice what I'm noticing. And from Liz, I'm thinking of where the chemistry is not great between me and the coachee. Yeah, great. Okay. So I think I just want to first take this to you, Tony, in terms of your own practice. And the first question is really, let's just think about what was the interest for you in terms of getting into this topic?
The interest in, I suppose, curiosity came when I was preparing some training for in the healthcare regulatory context, where people who are making decisions about a registrant when things have gone wrong. And they'd had all their equality and diversity training, but really it was trying to put stuff into practice. Mm-hmm. And actually what was coming up is actually a lot of things were happening unconsciously. So I started to do some research and work with them to surface what might be happening when they're in a hearing, when they're making decisions. And it was from that I thought, this actually applies in other aspects of my life. And then it worked on actually what's happening in my coaching. What is it that I might be bringing into a coaching session, what I might be thinking about a coachee, whatever it is, in relation to unconscious bias in myself. And then from that was, how might it be showing up in my coachee and the issues that they're actually bringing. And so that's really where it fitted. And there's been lots of research over about the last 20 years, but there wasn't a lot in relation to coaching. There's kind of the odd article here and there, and you can pick it up on the odd bit in a book. And so that started that self-reflection of how I was working with my coachees, but also what they were actually bringing in the session, particularly when there's personal relationships or dynamics going on, that sometimes these issues surface because they've formed a particular view about somebody which actually isn't based on evidence. And then slowly unpick those and enabling them to go, I now know, so making it conscious, that's how I respond in those circumstances. And then how do I choose to respond differently? So that's really where it all came from.
So with that awareness, I'm hearing there's a choice,
Yes.
In terms of, and I noticed the emphasis on perception versus evidence, really. So just to support our thinking about this, in terms of defining what we're actually referring to, it's a simple question, but what is unconscious bias?
It's where we have, or basically, our brains cannot process the amount of information in the world at the moment. There is just so much going on. I think they reckon around 10 million bits during the day, of which we can process about 40 to 50. That's the conscious stuff we know about. So therefore our brain is doing an awful lot of work behind the scenes. And the way that shows up is that we see a pattern of something happening and our brain will automatically go there, and we don't know how we've got there. And it can be that we are biased in favor of somebody. It can be we're biased against somebody, but potentially whichever way we jump, that's an unfair outcome, because we've actually had no part to play consciously about what's happened. as an example, it's one I noticed very quickly in myself, and I've had to work with, and therefore it's very conscious now. I used to have a thing about tattoos, and that came from the way in which I was brought up, culture, social background, and then when I was in private practice as a criminal lawyer, a lot of my clients had tattoos. So the first thing was, you're going before magistrates who are of a certain age, etc. You cover them up. But of course, that's a long time ago in my practice. And now, of course, they are everywhere. And, you know, when Dame Judi Dench at the age of 80 has one, you have to kind of revisit what you're thinking about and how the world is looking at something. And so I don't see it in the same way that they're only in relation to a certain group of people, and therefore there's a certain set of traits that I would ascribe to them. For me, it is now very conscious, but at one point it was very unconscious, because I just responded as, if you like, my brain had been trained through my growing up process, culture, context, etc.
So I mean, again, I'm just, I suppose at one level, the conscious element of this is really important. So, you know, if you think about a coaching session, raising awareness and helping the client become more aware of the decisions they're making and what they're basing those decisions on, rather than I'm hearing the unconscious movement towards or away from someone because of the bias that may be there. So I suppose what this brings up for me is just the whole humanness of this, you know, in terms of, you know, this is just part of being human beings. So I imagine how we meet that conscious awareness is really important. And again, I think of this from a mindfulness perspective, in terms of, you know, being kind to ourselves when we notice any bias that may be playing out. But just I suppose that may be helpful, Tony. Are there any sort of technical definitions that you use around unconscious bias, that, again, just so we hear a language around this, it might give it a bit more form?
Yeah, there are, they've kind of created a group or types, if you like, of unconscious bias. And I think actually that there is actually a slide on them, that basically that I picked out the ones which I thought possibly could appear in our coaching more often than some of the others. And that, so the first one they refer to as a beauty bias. So no ugly bias, just a beauty. But that means that when we see somebody, often there's an assumption that the most handsome individual will be the most successful. And so they get a benefit before you've actually had a conversation. But it could be anything in terms of the way people look. It could be the way they dress. It could be their hairstyle. It could be anything about their presence, that either you look upon them favorably, and therefore they start in a very different place, but you could also look at somebody unfavorably, and it's almost like they've got to work really hard to get to that place. The affinity bias, that can occur if we meet somebody from our hometown, or we support the same football team. I come from Liverpool. So if anybody says that's where they're from, there's a kind of instant connection, and I want to like them already. The fact is, the more I get to know them, it may well be that I don't like them. And the fact they come from Liverpool is not really a relevant consideration in the end. The horns and halo effect, they're the kind of the opposite of each other. And I think anybody who's worked in HR or as a manager will actually see this playing out quite regularly. But we could do the same with our coachees, which is the halo, where we've had a really great coaching session with somebody, or we think they're a great person, we're inspired by them. There's a kind of halo around them that we can benefit, and the next time we see them, they're already in that space. And there's a question about, well, does that mean we don't challenge them as much, or, you know, what again is playing out? But the opposite is the horns effect. If we've had a bad experience with a coachee, how do we turn up on the next occasion? Are we already assuming that it's going to be, as quotes, as bad as the last time? Or if they're late for the first session, are we assuming they're going to be late for the next? There's all sorts of things we can just assume and carry forward and be slightly biased already before they've even opened their mouths. And in the work environment, I suspect we see that quite a lot, where somebody perhaps hasn't done something very well, and it kind of follows them through their whole career. And everybody remembers that, but they don't remember the other 95% of that human being who does a really great job. So they're kind of, we're making an assumption they're all bad. Mm. Similarity is, I think, one that I see happening in terms of the coaching environment. We like people who are similar to us. And sometimes we find they're easier to coach because there's a kind of already a connection. They're quite like us. But it could be that we actually go, I know what you want. I can understand what you want. But actually, that means maybe we don't challenge as much as we ought to. Whereas if somebody is not as similar to us, does that mean actually we challenge more? Again, I don't know, but it's something to be aware of. Contrast, we can contrast our clients. We can have clients who we absolutely adore, wonderful relationships, work really well, and so look forward to meeting with them. But then you can have somebody who perhaps you contrast with that one, and you don't have such as good a relationship with, or you find them challenging. And that's probably easy to deal with when you don't see them perhaps on the same day. But what if you're actually coaching both of those people on the same day? How do you ensure that you're in the right space to deal with both of them as the best coach that you are? And the last one, confirmation, is I see that playing out potentially where you are in you have three-way contracting. So a manager has given you information perhaps about a coachee before you've met them. And it might well be that has an impact on your thinking when you meet the coachee, that you actually might be looking for confirmation of what has already been told to you, as opposed to potentially looking at the individual and making your own decision about them. So there's some of the ways I think that it could come up. I'm not saying it does. And actually, in some cases, it could be a very positive experience that you have in the way in which you work, and then that's okay. But it's when it potentially has an adverse impact on who you are, how you coach. But equally, you could see all of those happening in your coachee and the issues that they're bringing to coaching. And the one thing that all the research does say is, guess what? We're better at seeing it in other people than we are in ourselves. So the chances are you may see biases coming out in your coachee as you work with them a lot quicker than you do when you're actually doing any self-reflection.
Mm. And so I suppose there's a couple of things here, Tony. I mean, I appreciate there's a longer list of these biases, and these are the ones that you've pulled out in terms of
my bias piece, really.
yeah, but also, when we think about those relationships that we're holding, just in terms of what may be playing out for us. So before we build on this, I'm just going to again ask the people listening just to pause for a moment, and even just reflecting on that coachee I asked you to think about earlier. What might be playing out for you, in terms of the relationship. If there's any bias here that really resonate, it's just a moment of reflection. There's just a bit of personal reflection there. I think with any of these models, it gives us a bit more form to our thinking. We don't need to think about this as a truth. It helps us potentially see something that's playing out. I can see some questions coming through in terms of, so how we can manage this. Because as always, we can start to notice, and if we think, actually, Tony, to the conversation we had yesterday, and I was contrasting two of my coaching clients that I'd met in the day. So, this is a normal human process. And again, I'm just going to re-emphasize that because I think it's so important, even if we help the coachee recognize it in themselves, how then does the coachee meet that awareness? Do we start to judge ourselves for being terrible in terms of the decision we're making, or can we, have a softer way of dealing with this? So therefore there's more choice and freedom in terms of how we respond. Because for me, this is all about moving from reactiveness to more responsiveness and conscious responsiveness.
I think it very much is. There's been a change of when they started to look at bias, that everybody thought, oh, it's aberrant, it's conscious, it's intentional. But actually what they've realized is we all do it, and we have no choice but to do it, quite simply because we wouldn't be able to survive if we didn't do it. And so it is normal, it's unconscious, and it's largely unintentional. So we don't intend to behave in a particular way. The time when it's to be considered important is when perhaps it is having an impact on what we're doing, and that's really where, if you like, the self-reflection comes in. But also, there is a need to be kind to ourselves and compassionate, and particularly as some of our biases have been around for so long, and then and actually it's saying, okay, it may have served me well in the past for whatever reason, but perhaps it just doesn't serve me well in this situation, but it still may serve me well in other situations. So I certainly wouldn't want anybody to think that they've got to be harsh to themselves or judgmental, because we are always going to have this around. It's really just saying, is this having an impact on my coaching or my coachee, bringing something that I could perhaps help them with and identify, rather than anything else.
And I could just see there, Liz has just on the chat panel just said that a client of hers has recommended the Harvard Implicit Association Test, IAT, as a means of identifying your biases.
Yeah, that's actually referred to in one of the resources that we've got at the end.
Okay.
And that's one of the books, which actually is a really good, easy read about the whole subject. It's
So, Tony, you've mentioned reflection, and I imagine as coaches, this is something that we can introduce to our reflective practice. But in terms of a way of supporting us to both recognize this and then work with it, I mean, what thoughts have you got around what we can do?
I think the first thing is literally not to beat ourselves up about it. So I think that's really important, that before we do any work on it, we do take that point and have that understanding, treat ourselves with compassion. And then it's really surfacing, is it a question that is something happening here? What was my reaction when I first met this coachee? Was it a positive? Was it a negative? What was that based on? And so it's probably coaching ourselves in terms of the questions we just might be asking as to what's happening. And again, is there a way in which that's playing out in our body, in our felt sense? So that's where I think I've kind of been looking at those sort of things. I mean, it may well be that it's how do I react to certain people? There may be more than it's just one person. There may be a group of people I've reacted. So you can start seeing how it's working in your general life, and again, is the way in which you are generally then coming into your coaching. So it's just paying attention, I think, just to see what's happening.
So in terms of when we were preparing for this, we were thinking about perhaps some key questions as a coach we could ask ourselves. So on the screen, you can see there in terms of some ideas around questions. So what do I think I know about the coachee or his or her situation? And it's a check-in really around the data that I'm basing this on. How can I be sure of that as a check-in? How would I coach this coachee today if I didn't know anything about them? So again, it's just that sort of reset question, and becoming more intentional about how we want to work with somebody rather than the reactions that we're having. What bias, beliefs, attitude might be in the way of me doing my best coaching with this coachee? Again, these questions are just inviting that sort of dropping in and that sort of awareness. I think obviously this is a place for supervision as well. And I would say that in terms of the work you're exploring, often the unconscious relational dynamics that are at play with your coachees. So supervision is definitely a place for this as well. And And of course, with my own biases, I would often say that, having a core practice, so something like mindfulness, is a way of really starting not just to be present, but actually starting to tune into our thinking that we're holding about the coachee. So that sort of reflexivity, being able to reflect in the moment as we're with somebody, which often comes from practices such as mindfulness or embodiment practices, just as a way of coming back to center and that sort of horizontal relationship again. So just a question that's come through from Ruth. I just want to read a couple of questions out, Tony, and just see what comes really. So Ruth just asked, to what extent do our assumptions dictate our biases? And will exploring assumptions help us make biases conscious?
I think so. I'm going to go for the lawyerly answer, which is they probably are related. And again, is what is our assumption about it? And it might be that as you think about that, that is something you can go, is something that I'm biased because that's the way I think about this situation in all circumstances. It's a very simplistic one. I'm not very good with people who are late to sessions, which are, and again, I know where it comes from because that's the way I am, and my assumption is that they're being rude in terms of and not respectful of my time and etc. And I really have to manage that in terms of, well, I'm making an assumption that they are being rude. It may well be that there is a very good reason why they're late, and I have to stop myself from getting into quite a tense space, which I'm thinking more about that than actually when I'm coaching the person. So I really have to kind of deal with, but it's a small thing, but it's my assumption, my reaction, my bias in the moment. Maybe we have it with people who cancel their sessions quite frequently without very quickly before that they're meant to be meeting you, they're cancelling on the day or whatever without good reason. How are we turning up for the next one? Are we bringing something from our feelings about how that happened, and therefore an assumption for whatever reason they don't want to be coached, or is there a bias in the way in which we handle that situation? So yeah, I think they do tie together.
Yeah, and I think if I think about a coach I was working with about a decision that he was making about a relationship with another exec member, and for me that was the way into the bias. Exploring the bias with him was, what's the assumptions that he's making about the other person, and therefore we could then reflect on the facts, the data, etc., to challenge some of that. Because a lot of this for him was about the confirmation bias because of something that happened. He was looking for that evidence again. So I definitely think the assumptions is the way through. Just I suppose, just as we're starting to move towards the end of the session today, but just in terms of just what else is important to say about this, Tony, just from your experience of working with this in your own practice.
I think it really is that awareness for me, that I'm much more aware of what might be playing out for myself in a situation, but I'm working on knowing it more in the moment. So I think initially it's about, I recognize it when I've done the reflection after the session, but that informs me for how I want to be at the next session. So I think it is a bit of a process of learning, of seeing, and the more that you're aware of the things which I suppose you make a snap judgment or triggers something. For me, it's think about what's happened in the past to how you can be better in the future. But as that becomes the way in which you now see things, you can pick things up a lot quicker in the moment and therefore be able to manage yourself. And also there is that work that the more you see what's happening, it does reflect when you see it in your coachees a lot, and being able to actually help them recognize what's happening, and enabling them then to change their behaviors and perhaps even change their relationship with somebody, quite simply because it's been based on assumptions and biases that actually have no real evidence base, but people have got entrenched.
Mm. And I just want to pick up on a reflection from Selena. I'd assume some of the biases are about non-verbal or observations made of a person without formal communication or engagement. So a perception not necessarily based on some behaviours clearly exhibited. Yeah, which is true, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so in terms of resources, Tony,
yeah,
if people do want to read more, or I appreciate you found these two. So
that's the easy read, and that's the one that's the Harvard. That's the more weighty read, if you want a more academic read. But that one, okay. I think if you want to know more, that's the one I would recommend.
So Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, and that's the one that references the IAT part of the test. Yeah. If you want a more academic read, what you're saying is the Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah, it's weightier, smaller writing as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
great. Okay, so I wanted to keep this session quite punchy. We're just trying to experiment with shorter webinars. So I really hope that's been just sort of whetted your appetite, perhaps brought some more reflection to your own practice, perhaps some more structure in terms of thinking about what you may be reflecting on after you're working with your coachees. But also, just some references and resources that you can actually potentially use with your coaching clients. If they're bringing decisions, they're bringing relationship difficulties, etc., to them. Just before we end, I just wanted to mention that the next webinar actually will build on this session. So we're next coming together on the 3rd of February for a webinar on inclusive leadership. And that's with a colleague of mine, Tracy May, who's based out in Dubai, and a real specialist around cultural intelligence and inclusivity. So I really hope you can make the time for that next session. As I said at the start of this call today, that this session has been recorded, so you can always watch it again or look at any of the other webinars we've recorded last year on our YouTube channel. But in the meantime, I hope that's been useful, and look forward to connecting again soon. So thanks for joining today, and thanks for your time, Tony.
Thank you.